You are listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Isaac Warren. I am the Director of Digital Communications at the Illinois Association of School Boards. And with me today, I've got Sarah Miller, who is our Associate Executive Director of Governmental Relations. And we're going to be talking about the recent session, kind of some key bills that we talked about IASB was involved with, and just really getting down into how you can get involved as a listener and a member. So, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Isaac. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive right into our questions. The first question I've got for you is, from IASB's perspective, how would you sum up the 2026 legislative session for Illinois school districts, and what were the biggest wins and challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question, Isaac. And I think we had some of both this year. But certainly for wins, I kind of have to rewind back to last year. Last year, during the 2025 session, we worked really hard on a mandate reduction bill. And there were two components of that bill. One was to kind of get rid of some of those duplicative mandates, but the other big piece of that was the creation of a mandates reduction council. And that went into effect, and they have been meeting since, I don't know when they started meeting, but sometime last fall. But I think the fact that legislators have been involved in that committee and have really been talking through the current mandates and what can be done to reduce some of those current mandates really helped us this session, so that I think legislators had a better understanding of all of the mandates that districts are dealing with. And so I think one of the biggest wins that we really saw was that I think there was an understanding. So even though we had a lot of bills filed with curricular mandates, other mandates that would impose a cost on districts, I think we didn't see a lot of those move forward. And so I think when we were negotiating this year, more legislators were willing to try and do things to take out the mandates, if that makes sense. So, I mean, I think we're going to see some every session, but I think it was really helpful to have legislators more knowledgeable about the impact, being involved in those conversations about what our districts are currently dealing with. And particularly for the chairs, I think both education chairs in the House and the Senate really had worked on that legislation last year, and we're more willing to pause new mandates that they're putting on districts until we kind of work through what we're currently dealing with.
Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds like your that work from last year, priming the legislators kind of be aware of the impacts of additional mandates on school districts, really did help a lot, and kind of got all of that work out of the way, so you could focus on some more topical issues that were happening in the Senate. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. And, the other thing I was going to say, because I didn't get to some of the other wins, I think, and I know we're going to talk about the budget later, but I would just mention this was a really tight budget year for the state. And so I do think we did see some gains there that we didn't necessarily have last year. So I think overall, I think we were really happy on where public education fell in terms of funding. And some challenges, as many people are aware, we do have some districts around the Arlington Heights area that had been very involved in the mega project legislation that could result in the Bears Stadium. And so the fact that nothing happened with that, I know was disappointing probably for those districts and districts statewide that may have a mega project that could happen in their area. And the other challenge, many of our members received their call to action on the notice to remedy bill that was Senate Bill 2914. And that did end up passing despite our opposition and our work with other groups. And so I would say that's a little twofold, though, because I think one of the things that I saw is our members were really concerned with that bill. And I really saw a lot of engagement from our members. While we were disappointed in the fact that it did end up passing, I think I was really pleased to see how engaged our members got. And I heard from a lot of legislators that they were hearing from school board members. And I think we really need to build on that.
Sure. Yeah, that's some really good momentum to start having. And when we send out those call to actions, it's really good to hear that our members are engaging and really taking that seriously, especially when they understand how significant these impacts can be in their own personal communities. And I think that really drives why it is important that if you've got an issue and your legislator doesn't know about it, you need to let them know, because they may not understand the full impact of what they're voting on.
Yeah, and I think that was the case here, and I think some of the issues are a little bit easier to understand, and you can file a witness slip or send an email. But I do think with this notice to remedy bill, it was very nuanced and really did require explaining to legislators, this is what the process is, this is how it would change the process, and this is why it's a problem. And that took a little bit more time and energy to do that. But I think that can be really helpful in those types of situations where the bill is something very nuanced, specific to public education, and requires a little more explanation.
Sure. And on the topic of bills, let's talk about a bill that wasn't quite as nuanced and a bit more straightforward. Senate Bill 2427 about student cell phone use. That got a lot of attention this round. What role did IASB play in shaping that bill, and how did you balance local control with statewide guidance?
Well, this is a bill that was actually introduced last year, and we had a lot of negotiations. In any negotiations, we'll typically talk to the legislator. So we talked to the Senate sponsor. We shared some concerns. We offered some language. This is one that the governor's office was very involved in as well. And so we engaged quite a bit with the governor's office on this one. And just, it's a lot of conversations and really understanding the impact. For us, we really tried to get a good understanding of what our districts currently were doing in terms of policies, because one of the things going in to this, to negotiating this bill, we didn't want anything that was working for our districts to have to be taken away. So that was part of the conversation. And I think, we heard different things from districts. I think some districts said, we can do this already. We have the ability to create our own policies. We don't need something. And then we did hear from other districts that said, it would be helpful because we do get pushback from parents and students sometime. And so it would be helpful to say, yes, this is something that needs to be done and to work within the parameters of that. And so I think we really did accomplish something that really, said for the most part, during the school day, cell phones need to be put away. So we got some flexibility with how those were stored because we didn't want to create a costly mandate for our districts. And some districts have said, you know what, you put them in a shoebox at the beginning of class and then the student gets them back and that works just fine. Others have invested in yonder pouches, all kinds of things. And so we just wanted to make sure that there was some flexibility there. But I think the general consensus is that for the most part, they should be away. The one shift from last year to this year is the language in the bill last year said they only needed to be put away during instructional time. And this year, it was really important to the sponsor and to the governor's office that districts move more to a bell to bell. So, in talking to districts and really working with other management groups, we felt like that was feasible for K through 8. And a lot of our districts were currently doing that for K to 8. But one of the things we heard from high school districts is once kids get to high school, you really are trying to foster more independence, help them make good decisions on their own. Some of those students go off campus. They might need to have their phone for lunch period. So I think one of the changes that we were able to secure, and we really had good conversations with the sponsor, the House sponsor and the governor's office, is to allow some flexibility during lunch and passing periods for high schoolers. So those are the types of conversations that we had. There's some things that you're going to need to let students use their cell phone for if they have an IEP, if they have a 504 plan that specifically requires it, all kinds of things. So we had to walk through when do they need their cell phones and when should there be discretion and when shouldn't there be discretion. So and just the timing of it, so this would go into effect in the 2027-28 school year. So next year, IASB will be working on developing a policy. In this legislation, the State Board of Education will be putting together a sample policy by September 1st. And so we will be working off of that policy most likely and working with ISB to see what they come up with.
That sounds like a pretty healthy kind of middle ground there where you've got the state saying, here's your cell phones are no longer required or allowed in school during term periods, but they leave it up to the school district to kind of determine how to best implement that for their district instead of heavy-handedly saying, here's how you must do this, and it must be done at a certain time. And that's just a lot of undue burden for the school districts. But it sounds like, at least with this one, districts have a bit of a say in how to execute that. So that's really good.
Yeah. And the one thing I would add too is that they also did offer, if a district has a policy, it has to meet certain conditions. But if they have a policy in place that is working for their district, if it meets that conditions, there's a 4-year kind of grace period where they can keep that policy. And then after whenever that expires, I can't remember the exact date, but then they would have to implement the requirements of this policy. So I think that grace period could be helpful to districts as well.
That sounds like a really good win for IASB and collaborating with legislators there. And another one we can talk about, Illinois is one of the leading states on biometric privacy. We've seen this with a lot of the class action lawsuits with different social media companies. Can you go into how IASB worked with the AI and biometric bill and what some of the practical implications of that bill for districts could be?
Sure. So there was actually a lot of interest all around, not just in the education realm, but really big interest from both the House and the Senate on ed tech, AI in general, not just how it impacts public education, but all kinds of things. As you mentioned, biometric information, but also, centers and social media, all of these different platforms. So there was just a lot of discussion around all of those topics. And we really worked in the Senate quite a bit. I know the House was holding some hearings, but they didn't impact K-12 education as much as some of the proposals in the Senate. So the Senate actually held a very lengthy 2-day subject matter hearing on all things AI, ed tech, biometric related. And IASB did submit written testimony for that. We did testify for that. And so the bill that we were actually responding to was one that was filed by Senator Martwick and dealt with 3 things. One was student privacy as it relates to the ed technology that districts are using. There was another piece on AI. And really it was an interesting spin because we had been talking for over a year on the cell phone bill and personal devices. But there has been more of a conversation coming nationwide about district issued devices and what students should be using in terms of, one-on-one technology. And should that be used at the lower grade levels? And I think a growing conversation is, should parents have the right to opt out of their kids using that? So and I think that really stems from growing concerns on AI and, making sure that kids are doing their own work. And I think parents are also trying to limit the use. Some parents are trying to limit the use of personal devices at home, and then they go to school, and there sometimes can be a reliance on that. And so I think that is going to become a bigger conversation going forward, because I think, certainly we want to prepare kids for careers and college and anything that they're going to do in the post-secondary world. And I think technology is going to be a big part of that. So how do we prepare kids? But, when do we need to start incorporating technology regularly? And so I think there are some conversations that are happening nationwide about, should we kind of, lay off of the technology devices in the younger years, or, should that be an opt-out? Should it just be done, universally by the district? So those conversations were had. And then the last piece that I wanted to mention, as you said, the biometric info, that was definitely a conversation that we had. And what is the appropriate use of biometric information? And just so everyone knows, there is legislation in place right now. If the district ever were to collect biometric information, there's all kinds of things they would have to they would have to notify the parents, they would have to obtain consent. It deals with when that would have to be destroyed. But I think the conversation is, do districts ever need that at all? And so there's certain things, for kids with IEPs, I think with assistive technology, that certain programs could be really, really useful to them. And so one of the things the sponsors was very open to is that if there have been technology gains that would really help kids with disabilities, he really wanted to make sure that wasn't impacted. So all of this is to say, Isaac, is that there was this big bill that was introduced. We did provide some red line and said, hey, this is where some bigger conversations need to play out. Here's some things that we could do now. That one big bill was eventually divided into two smaller bills. One dealt with, not smaller, but other bills that were, one dealt with biometric information. The other dealt with just some limited AI use and how teachers could use it in certain instances. Those bills did pass out of the Senate, but they stalled in the House. And as I mentioned earlier, the House was having its own conversations. So I think going forward, I'm just interested to see in how those conversations merge and what will move forward and what requires more conversation.
And it's good that these conversations are happening now. I mean, before AI gets really, really embedded into classrooms, because we don't know what really will happen with that. AI is still pretty early on in its infancy.
The one thing I would add is that last session in 2025, a bill passed to require the State Board of Education to develop guidance. And so one of the things that we did share with legislators is, certainly there's some things that we could do now, but that guidance is coming out July 1st. And this is something that Dr. Sanders really spearheaded and was very passionate about. So to some extent, we'd like to see what that guidance looks like and could it inform this legislation and help us to have more nuanced conversations about it.
Looking at the budget, how did IASB advocate for school funding this year? And where did the final budget land compared to where districts were maybe hoping for?
Just as a reminder, so last year, well, let's even go back further. Let's go back 10 years. So when the evidence-based funding formula passed, it was a statutory requirement that it get funded at $350 million each year. So with the exception of 1 year during the pandemic, the legislature has been really good, always put the $350 million in there. I think the one thing that we kind of forget about is that $350 million is actually divided up into two components. $300 million goes into what we call tier funding that goes directly to the schools. And then there was $50 million that was for property tax relief grants. And so that went to school districts as well, but you had to apply for these grants. And as a condition of getting these grants, you had to pay property taxes for 2 years. So those have always been the two components. And I think some questions had been raised within the past couple of years about how effective that property tax relief grant was. But last year, they took that property tax relief grant piece out of the budget. So it looked like EBF had been reduced, and it had, from $350 million to I think it was like $307 million, but it was only reduced to the extent that they eliminated the property tax relief grant. So that was one big piece of the budget that we wanted to see what would happen with EBF. But the other piece that we've been very focused on, as well as many other stakeholders, is the mandated categoricals. And what those are those pieces of the budget that could not or did not fit into the EBF at the time it was developed. And so those are transportation costs for all your students, which can be really significant for some of our bigger suburban districts, for our rural districts. Also special ed transportation. That's a cost for all districts. Special ed, when you have students that you can't serve at your own school district, and in order for them to get their education, they need to be put at a separate placement. So those are actually funded through mandated categoricals as well. So we have seen huge decreases in those over the years. And so we really have been focusing on increasing funding for that. So we had at least hoped to keep what we call the prorations flat to last year. That would have required $151 million in new dollars. We didn't quite see that, but we did get $68 million. And actually a big portion, there was some new funding for the transportation line items for the special ed facilities. But for the first time in a really long time, we saw an increase to the free and reduced lunch line item. And so there was $17 million more that was put into that, which I really think, was probably a result of conversations about SNAP benefits and changes at the federal level. And so investing in at least those services that districts are providing to students. So all in all, I think, wasn't necessarily everything that we wanted, but, for MCATs, we saw an increase in $68 million. And then, if I didn't say it already, they did bring back the property tax relief grant. And so EBF was funded at the $350 million. And that really shows that legislators were hearing from constituents that property tax relief should be kept in and should have a role. The one change that I do want to mention to districts that if you do receive that grant, in the past you had to abate property taxes for 2 years, and the one change we saw is that you would now have to abate taxes for 3 years. But that's just something to keep in mind.
You kind of touched on this with evidence-based funding. Are there any areas where ISB feels progress was made or maybe concerns remain with EBF?
Well, I think, with EBF, I mean, the fact that it was fully funded, there still is a commitment to that. I think we're still really far from adequacy. And it's just a challenge where it's just a tight budget year for the state all around. And I think they're still dealing with some of the impacts of the changes made on the federal level and how that will impact SNAP benefits and Medicaid. And so we always just have to keep in mind that the legislature is dealing with so much more than public education. And so they're just looking at the budget from a holistic perspective. And we're obviously focused on EBF, mandated categoricals. But I think with progress, so it was great to see that we got the 350 million. And it was great to see that a lot of the advocacy we did around MCATs and mandated categoricals was heard. And so we got some funding there. One of the other pieces that I think is going to be really positive, we also saw in the budget implementation plan, we did see a requirement that ISB conduct a study on transportation costs. Because the one thing I've been hearing from our districts is that those are escalating exponentially from year to year. And so I think that will be helpful to kind of dive into that and get a better understanding of why they're increasing so much. Because as a mandate, districts have to provide those transportation services. And if they only get one or two, proposals when they go out to bid, they really don't have a lot of control over those costs. So I think that's something that I think will be really positive once ISB is able to do that study.
What was the process of engaging with lawmakers like during the session? And where do you feel ISB made the biggest difference this year?
I will say one of the things that, and this might go back to the first question with our win and the biggest difference, I think our reintroduction of Advocacy Day. My understanding is that years ago, IASB had done this, perhaps in conjunction with some other organizations, but we really heard from members that they wanted to do this. And so we did put together a state advocacy day that incurred, I believe it was in March. We originally thought it would be in April, but the session just didn't line up. So it was in March. We had over 70 members come down to Springfield and meet with their legislators. And we actually did a morning session where we had President Harmon, we had the governor's office come talk to our members. So really robust conversations in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we went to the Capitol. They met with their legislators. And I think it's really impactful for legislators to see that our board members, that this is a priority for them and that they are showing up. They want to talk about these issues. They're following what they're doing in Springfield. So I think that was a really huge difference maker for us this year. I think advocacy ambassadors, that has really grown. Our new director, Jen Choke, has really taken that to a new level. And we have over 200 more members, I believe, that are part of that now. So just really working to keep members informed, direct outreach to tell them where their engagement would be most impactful, but also just showing up once a year and talking face to face with legislators, I think really made a difference.
Hopefully our listeners are listening to this and thinking like, this is just something that's amazing. Maybe they want to even get more involved with what they're doing. How would you say our members could best get involved with advocacy to ensure that their voice is heard?
So, I mean, signing up for advocacy ambassadors, and we are going to be continuing with that program, but we're also really looking at how to improve it over the next year. So any suggestions on that, reach out to myself or Jen Choke, and we're really going to be working this summer on what it's going to look like next year. But the other two things I would say is we are going to be doing another advocacy day. It will likely be in the March, April timeframe, but we can't finalize it until we see what the session calendar looks like, because we don't want people to come to Springfield when legislators aren't there. But we will be doing that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is, obviously we do a lot of work at the state level, but we just, we hired someone a year ago, Kristen Fitzgerald, who does federal work. And we have an advocacy conference that we do collaboratively with COSBA. COSBA really takes the lead on the conference part, but then Kristen arranges all the meetings with legislators. She's creating all kinds of Illinois-specific events, and that is in DC from September 21st through 23rd. And I believe the registration, at least the early bird discount, goes through July 20th. And I think you might still be able to register after that if there's room. But we have been telling people that this conference does fill up. And so if that's of interest to our members to meet with your federal legislators, go to DC, I would really encourage board members to do that too. It's a great conference, and Kristen does an amazing job making sure you are going to be busy and getting the most out of your experience for the 2 days that you're there.
Yeah, and for our listeners who haven't listened to her episode where I interviewed her when she first started working at IASB, I'd highly recommend listening to that because she really is passionate about this federal work, and it's really encouraging and really invigorating to hear her passion. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about this past general session. I think we did a lot of great work this year. Looking forward to seeing what we're going to do this next session, and hopefully we get some more folks sign up for Advocacy Ambassadors, Advocacy Day, and just getting more involved in general.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Isaac.
Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your platform of choice. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to send us an email at communications@iasb.com. Thank you.